Thank you for joining us this morning for our CCHE learning session on post-secondary outcomes. My name is Commissioner Eric Tucker, and I will be starting our session off this morning. I'd like to acknowledge our guest speakers for joining us here this morning. We have Jamie Marasotis, President and CEO of the Lumina Foundation, Rachel Carlson, Founder and CEO of Guild Education, Mamie Voigt, Managing Partner of Postsecondary Value Commission, and we will be joined a little bit later by Michael Ikowitz, Senior Fellow of Third Way. The purpose of our meeting this morning is to provide a high-level intro into the work of a diverse group of those that are at the forefront nationally on this topic of post-secondary educational outcomes, prompting awareness and hopefully to expand our thoughts. We will not reach any conclusions today, but we will have the opportunity to learn from the expertise assembled here and discover where we may want to follow up for a deeper consideration. With that said, I will hand this conversation over to our moderator, Commissioner Josh Scott. Josh, over to you. Thank you this morning.
Thanks, Eric. And thank you everybody for taking the time out of your morning to join us today. And huge thank you to all of our guest experts who made special time to be able to do this from across the country, and will bring wonderful insight into this conversation. As a reminder, Zoom has a Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. So you're just going to click on that Q&A button and type your questions in. I'll integrate questions in throughout the conversation today, and then we have a chunk of time specifically dedicated to questions at the end. But don't hold them. Please feel free to share questions throughout, and we'll sprinkle them into the conversation appropriately as it plays itself out. With that said, let's start the conversation with Jamie. Jamie, Lumina has established an ambitious goal of 60% post-secondary educational attainment by 2025. Well, in your book, Human Work in the Age of Smart Machines, you discuss the fact that something often gets lost in translation between the credentials granted by post-secondary institutions and the needs of employers, calling out specifically that it's not clear what most post-secondary credentials represent in terms of knowledge or skills and abilities. In light of this, and drawing on your knowledge of best practices around the country, how might we in Colorado establish a vision for better alignment between the needs of our economy and post-secondary outcomes?
Thanks very much, Scott, Josh, I was going to call you Commissioner Scott, but I was like, I could just call you Josh.
Josh is better. That's fine.
And thank you also to the other members of the commission and Angie and guests. And I'm really excited to be on this panel, people who I admire and respect in terms of the work that they do. Happy St. Patrick's Day to everyone. It's a snowy day, so there could be worse things to do than have a pint later in the day. I wanted to begin just by thanking the commission for the leadership that you've shown. It's worth underscoring this point as I talk a little bit about your question about the better alignment between the economy and the outcomes, because I think that the commission is very much aligned with us at Lumina Foundation, getting more people into and through post-secondary education in order to succeed in a changing world is really important. I really want to congratulate you on the work that you've done, setting a very ambitious attainment goal, doing really important work, I think, around trying to push the edge when it comes to the specific mechanics, the mechanisms that are needed to actually create that new system, focusing on funding models, comprehensive student financial aid, wraparound support programs to complete college and partnering with the workforce. I think all of those things are really, really important in terms of that alignment. At the same time, I think we've got to think about the sort of bigger question. And the bigger question, it's a question that I've gotten my entire career, but it's really loud and pronounced now, which is what people keep asking me as, the CEO of Lumina Foundation: what is education for? Why are we preparing people for the future of work? And what does that really mean? And, as you said, I wrote this book about human work. And, one of my answers to that question is education prepares people for the work that only humans can do. right? So, thinking about how work is changing because of technology and AI and automation is really important, because we need to have a better understanding of what machines are good at. They're good at repetition and speed, reduction to algorithm, but machines also have limitations. They don't understand subtlety and nuance. They don't understand how people react to each other. We are, as we're doing on this panel, very human. We are unpredictable. We do things that communicate in different ways than the machines do. So, I'm not so worried about this question about, are the robots coming to eat our jobs? Although I think, some robots will eat some of our jobs. That's the way technology has always worked. But we've also learned that technology in the end creates more jobs than it destroys. And it is the question about what we are going to do in response to that creative destruction that will allow us to renew the human work ecosystem in ways that'll really matter. And here I think we've got to focus on what really matters to us as humans, which is that work has to lead to a life of meaning and purpose. We've got to find dignity in work. We've got to find ways in which we're going to contribute to a greater world. We know what happened in the 2008-2010 recession. Lots of jobs got destroyed that didn't come back, but the jobs that were good and continue to be good were mostly jobs for people with bachelor's degrees, some associate degrees, people with post-secondary credentials of some time. So, now we're living in this world where we're trying to emerge from this pandemic, and 2 out of 5 Americans say they have significant concerns about their lack of skills or skills obsolescence. So it's our responsibility to help those individuals find a new meaning and purpose in their work by participating in this virtuous cycle of learning, earning, and serving others, which I think is key to human work. So, how are we going to do that? Well, part of the way that we can do that, and part of the way that we can create that better alignment, is to think about this connection between learning and work. One of the things that's really important to focus on is that as humans, we learn differently than machines do, right? Deep learning, the machine learning concept is really about computers learning by, digging down deeper and deeper into data sets using algorithms in order to reach conclusions. For humans, we do wide learning, what I call wide learning, right? So time is a very important factor in the way that we learn. It's that virtuous cycle that I talked about. And importantly, and companies like Guild really understand this is not something that you do just once in your life. Early in your life, you do it over and over again. And so my argument is that the days of one and done education are over, and we've got to think about that when it comes to that alignment. The second is, we've got to think very seriously about wide learning in terms of the people doing the learning. It's got to serve a very diverse array of people, diverse in terms of their race and their ethnicity, their gender, their immigration status, a lot of other factors. One way to think about this is that workers today not only need some education after high school, but they're going to have to reskill and upskill wherever they're coming from, whatever their circumstances are. So, to me, we need a system that puts the individual in the center. In other words, one that focuses on their learning rather than this sort of broader concept of education, one that focuses on them as individuals rather than simply the institutions of higher education, which historically is what we've thought of as the system, and one that focuses on work rather than just what we traditionally call jobs, because lots of people work, but they're not working in what we call a job. The last point I'll make is just that, the other dimension of wide learning is the content. What people have to learn to be successful in this human work ecosystem has to represent those human traits and capabilities that I was talking about. And, we are different than the machines. We are compassionate. We make ethical decisions. We have an ability to collaborate and communicate with other humans. We've got to do that. We've got to build those skills in a better way and figure out how they complement what the machines do, because the machines can do lots of things really, really well. Underscoring all of this is that we have to be clear about the objectives of the system when it comes to equity. To me, this idea, this promise of American opportunity has always been in sharp contrast with the nation's legacy of discrimination and oppression from a racial perspective. And, lack of access to high quality learning opportunities has significantly impeded the ability of Black, Hispanic or Latino and Native Americans to advance economically and secure good jobs. Unfortunately, Colorado's not immune to these issues. You have, on the one hand, something you should be really proud of, which is the second highest attainment rate in the nation. But at the second, on the other hand, your equity gaps, the students of color who are failed by our current system, are also the second highest in the nation. So, it's worth saying that making notable progress across all demographics is going to be really important. I have a lot of confidence in the commission and your abilities, but I want to underscore that point. Thanks again for the chance to be here. Looking forward to our conversation.
Thanks, Jamie. So appreciate your comments in that regard. And I think you've well laid out the challenge in front of us. Would love to bring Rachel into this conversation now. Rachel, what are the post-secondary outcomes that are most important to the employers and students with whom you work in your capacity at Guild? And how do these desired outcomes inform the way you choose academic partners with whom to work at Guild?
Thanks, Josh. That's a fun question to answer because it's something we think about all the time. Let me start with our learners and share a bit about them and then what they seek out of us. We today represent over 5 million Americans who have access to Guild's platform through their employer. They're not all in the classroom at any one time. Many will use us for career services or auxiliary services, but at any one time, typically 5 to 10% of a company's employee base is in the classroom with us. And who those employees represent, they're 60% female, 55% learners of color, and about 80 to 90% defined as low income learners, depending on the state and the job category. So what do they want? The number one reason why Guild's learners are enrolling in one of our 140 partners is career advancement. And that's the case for 83% of the folks who visit us. They say that advancing in their career is the primary motivation. Behind that, we see increased earnings and personal growth in the 60% category. Personal opportunity beyond wage growth also comes up quite a bit. And then, we're worth noting today, and this is a major shift we've seen over 7 years, finishing a degree is only a primary motivation for 38% of learners. And that doesn't mean that completing isn't important. Many talk about completion as the goal, gaining the full set of skills, reaching a personal goal, setting a role model for their family. But for most of them, completion is a means to an end, the job. And the job is the primary motivation. And that's something we think about a lot because one of the core reasons our students pause in school, I'm not a big fan of the term dropout because I think we've really put it onto people and called them dropouts. And there's a lot of shame wrapped up in that. But one of the main reasons our students pause is that they get a promotion at work. And that doesn't mean it's good. But it doesn't also mean it's bad. And in most cases, we're seeing them get promoted into salaried jobs and they say, hey, I've got a bunch of new responsibilities. I need to press pause on my education. So just an interesting thing to think about from the learner perspective. For employers think about efficiency and the return on investment against their corporate goals. Mobility, which is a factor of completion and job outcomes, is normally the key driver. And they're thinking about what is the upside on that mobility opportunity relative to the cost of the education and the upskilling that they're investing in. It does, however, look specific by industry. So for healthcare, for example, the key outcomes are often specific certifications and licensure passage rates. In other cases, like financial services, call centers, and retail, the primary outcome is filling talent pipelines, both in the front line. So how do you use education as a benefit to attract great workers? And then increasingly, especially in the war for talent, how to use education to upskill your frontline workforce. Because the reality is, if somebody coming out of undergrad wants to work in cybersecurity, they're going to go to a Google, a Facebook, a technology company. The Walmarts and even the JP Morgans of the world aren't going to be able to compete with Google for cybersecurity and data analytics talent. They have to build their own. And that's a really exciting movement that we're seeing in the employer sector. It's one of the benefits of this war for talent is that employers are giving their employees a better shot at internal mobility, which I think we all know is a really great thing for our economy and for our learners. And then the last piece of your question was about measuring academic partners. So we look at it on a program by program level. While we work with 140 institutions intimately, and we can help a student attend any of the 7,000 schools in the US, we think really specifically about the 2,200 programs we've curated from those schools. So we look at a range of outcomes, and we run an outcomes-based quality assurance process that really looks at 4 key categories. Career mobility is number 1. How are the programs measuring against career advancement on uplift in promotion and wage increases? The second is attainment, the measure through which students are progressing through and then completing programs, which captures retention as well as completion. Satisfaction, what is the learner's NPS on the program, their likelihood to recommend it to another peer? And then lastly, equity. How do those outcomes break down student by student against seen and unseen diversity characteristics? And I think that last piece is really important, especially for this new era. COVID has completely disrupted which populations want to learn online, but we found that many schools that had been building great online programs in the 2000s or even the earliest folks in the 90s historically served middle-class white women quite well. But are now in a phase of adapting to serving a more heterogeneous student population. And so we spend a lot of our time collecting primary data because the data we have available to us at the federal level doesn't always help us understand those demographics. So I'll pause there. Those are the 3 categories for us.
Thank you, Rachel. Super helpful. Let me open it up a bit. And I know, having been on many a Zoom call over the course of the past year with many of you all who are participants in this conversation today, that you're not shy. So fire away with questions, put them into the Q&A, and I'm happy to read them out. We'll give you a couple of minutes to do that, but I want to make sure that your questions are getting surfaced for everybody here as we work our way through the conversation today. Here we go. We have a question. I'm interested in your thoughts on the following framing. Succeeding in human work is a subset of succeeding in human life society. Education, especially four-year post-secondary education, has the larger goal of supporting success as a human in relationships, including personal and societal, and participating in addressing the complex challenges facing the world today. Anybody who wants to jump in on that, please feel free.
I can start and just make an observation, which is that there's been a long history of of talking past each other when it comes to these conversations, because a lot of what employers have said in modern memory is that what they most value is the ability of people to collaborate, to be critical thinkers, to problem solve, to communicate, all of these things that are reflections of our human traits and characteristics. They also need you to know something about graphic design or chemistry or whatever else it is. So it is the balance between those things that's really important. And I think that we've had these conversations about topics like STEM, which are hugely important because of the dramatically higher needs that we have in terms of STEM talent, assuming that we don't need these other things. In other words, that these other things are secondary. And to me, they have to coexist, and we have to continue to sort of ratchet them up over time in that virtuous cycle that I was talking about. To me, that's what's really important. And so, even the distinction between education and training, I think they're largely false distinctions at this point. It doesn't make sense for us to have education that's devoid of specific job skills, nor does it make sense for there to be training that doesn't build your ethical decision-making and your compassion and your collaboration and all those other things. So to me, it's going to be really important to think about those things as really co-equals in this system.
Completely agree, Jamie, and thank you for that. I mean, I think that it's really one of the many situations in life that's an and not an or. We need both. And I think we, from my perspective, need to recognize that career advancement and professional opportunity is a set of things that represents a pretty low-level reality on the hierarchy of needs. And so we should make sure that we are satisfying those needs, particularly of paying students. But we also need to do these other things that are really important for society. And so striking that balance, I think, is incredibly important. Rachel, I'll pose Joe's question to you here and put you on the spot. Joe Garcia asks, how many community college programs are among those curated by Guild, and how can we become more involved as Colorado institutions?
Hi, Joe. It's good to see you. We have about 60 community colleges in the crew right now, and would love to have some additional Colorado programs. What I'll emphasize is that, but for our healthcare system partners today, every employer we work with is national, which means when they curate a program, they want that program to be available nationally. So the big push that we've made with our local partners in any city or state is making sure that as many of their programs as possible have been fully adapted and are available in all 50 states, or at least the NC SARA states as available. And that's just so important to employers, because what they don't have the capability to do is feature, one program to a person in one city and state and another because they think like a national employer. Their healthcare benefits are national, their other elements are national, their L&D is. And so that's been the historic barrier for us. But I think especially in COVID, so many schools did so much adaptation to making their programs nationally available. So you know where to find me, but I would love to connect you with our president of academic partnerships and get deeper on that.
Terrific. I'll ask one more question here that came in through the chat, and then we'll circle back to a bunch more of these questions later in the conversation, but also want to loop other folks in. So the question that I'll ask here is, are we entering an era where the degree is no longer the primary currency of higher ed, but instead certificates and skills?
I can start, and then Jamie, you can add on. My answer is that this is similar to what Josh was just saying. This is a yes and. So what we find is that certificates and skills sit in somewhat on a Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We know that they are often a tool that can leapfrog someone from a $12, $15, $17 an hour job into 20, putting them at a 40K salary, into something that's a family sustaining wage in local communities. But one, a lot of our learners don't want to stop there. And two, I don't know or believe that they ought to. We do actually see a fair amount today of disintegration at the master's degree level. I would argue that the credential and certificate is cannibalizing the master's degree. I believe it is supplementing the bachelor's degree when we build for stackability, when we design for transferability. And it's not just higher ed's credential and certificate, it's also employers' credential and certificate. I spent way too many years and way too much tuition at Stanford University, but the first time I saw AI and virtual reality used effectively in a classroom was in the back of a Walmart, where they were using it to train employees for virtual reality simulations. And taking a lot of people management courses, the best people management I've ever seen is at Chipotle. And so I say that because I think the stackability has to include the learning on the job and the learning in classrooms, in credentials and certificates, but we got to stack that all into bachelor's degrees from my perspective.
And just to add to Rachel's really, really good points, which I fully agree with, it's, again, I think it's a conversation that seems to suggest that it's an either or question. And I agree, it's a yes and. To me, what we need to be talking about is more and better credentials and understanding the value of the connections among those credentials over time. So there's a lot of noise in the data, right? So we know, for example, that, a quarter of people who have associate degrees make more than people who have bachelor's degrees. Doesn't mean bachelor's degrees are bad. It means that in certain areas, people with associate degrees can do quite well. So in that ecosystem, and same is true in certifications and certificates and other kinds of credentials that we see. So thinking about this question, I think all of these things are credentials. And that's an important point here, which is that people tend to think that credentials are not degrees. Degrees are credentials. Degrees are one form of credential, and they're an important part of the credentialing system, but they're not the only kind. And there are lots of ways in which we need to think about that cycle of learning over life, where you do need different kinds of credentials because work really is changing, and that evolution of work is going to require you to broaden and deepen your human work skill set over time. So I think that if we get into this extended debate about are degrees really worth it, it's largely a waste of time. Overwhelmingly, we know that if you don't have a post-secondary credential, your chances of being in the middle class are almost zero in American society today. And at the same time that we know that the value of credentials is very high, but that those credentials, the value of those credentials can disintegrate and they can expire over time. So you've got to continue. It's not a one and done process. As I said earlier, you really got to continue that learning journey over your lifetime.
Thanks, Jamie, and thank you, Rachel. We'll continue to circle back with more questions for both of you and the rest of the group, but I want to loop in Michael now as well, who's done some incredibly impressive work in this regard, and hopefully you all took a moment to read in the pre-read about some of the work that Michael has done. Michael, of the potential approaches to reimagining how we measure efficacy in delivering desired post-secondary outcomes, how did you land on price to earnings premium and economic mobility index? And what do you feel are the strengths and shortcomings of those two approaches?
Well, I'm getting sidetracked because there's so many good questions. Someone just mentioned their own social mobility index that I'm going to need to check out. But I think the point is, it's great that folks are thinking about this and reacting to this and thinking about how they can get better on this. I think that the conversation has changed dramatically over the past 4 or 5 years, and we have moved from completion to value. And it's really interesting to hear the survey on what folks are interested in terms of what they want to get out of a credential or degree. That's why I've been focusing on this, is we've seen year after year, the #1 reason why folks are interested in obtaining a post-secondary certificate or degree is to get a better job and have a financially secure future. These are just the facts. This is the #1 reason. That doesn't mean that's what everything that higher education produces by any means, but from a consumer perspective, whether you're an artist or a teacher or an engineer, this is one of the main reasons that 90% of people are attending higher education. So I wanted to look at this and say, okay, well, is higher education delivering? And it's really important from a consumer perspective, because it can either be the quickest engine to socioeconomic mobility or the quickest route to unmanageable debt and a lifetime of uncertainty. So I started to look at this thing called the price to earnings index. And the thought was, if stock analysts can do this, and they do this all the time, why can't anyone, the 15 million students that are attending college, do this every single day? And how can I help them to make an easier and better decision? And just so folks know, like, I used to help with the college scorecard at the US Department of Education. So this is like a natural, thought process of how can we still do better? And how can we get it into the hands of the people that need it the most? So basically, I started looking at the price that students pay for each credential, and you have this information online. And the department has just started to produce earnings data. And we could talk about the facility and the usefulness of that. But originally, they put it for the institution level itself. And I wanted to know, based off of the cost that you're paying for a credential, whether it be a certificate, an associate's degree, or a bachelor's degree, and also relative to the actual earnings premium that you get, that's the amount that you earn more than the average high school graduate within your state, how quickly can you pay off this credential, whether it be a certificate, an associate's degree, or a bachelor's degree? And I think what I found was really exciting. And what we all kind of know, and why we're in this business, is college is still worth it. Most institutions provide on this promise regularly, and they also do it for low-income students regularly. But what I also found is that there's a large chunk of institutions that aren't necessarily delivering on this promise, and they're providing no economic ROI. Now, what does that mean? It means the majority of the students are attending college, and even 10 years afterwards, they're still earning less than someone with no college experience whatsoever. This is the majority of students. And I do just want to mention this about certificates, since we're in such a hot topic nowadays, is like Jamie said, like, we want more high quality certificates, period. If a student is able to go to college for 6 to 18 months and have a quick economic return while only paying about a year of costs, it's one of the quickest engines to socioeconomic mobility. Like,
not to mention the lower opportunity cost in doing so, right?
There is no doubt, and it's quick, right? You don't have to spend 4 years. obtaining this degree and also having lost opportunity costs. You're actually able to enter the labor force very, very quickly. Now, all that being said, what I find in this research with data, it shows that 50% of institutions that focus on certificates now, these are federally funded institutions, they actually leave the majority of their low-income students, their most vulnerable students, earning less than the average high school graduate, even 10 years later, right? So we see that so many are succeeding in this, like doing really, really well, but they are disproportionately more likely to leave these students earning less than someone with no college experience. So that's something that we all need to keep in mind and think about how we continuously improve upon good certificates. And when I say good certificates too, another thing that I looked at is beyond institution, we have program level data, right? So Guild's using it, they're interested in it. Jamie's, we're aware of it, like we're all kind of aware of it. And institutions are just becoming aware of it, I would say, right? Like it's sort of new. There's 2 years worth of earnings data at the program level. So now can I not only look at Miami-Dade College, but I can look within Miami-Dade College and I can see how much engineering, or teachers are making, how much nurses are making 2 years after their degree, how much elevator technicians are making. And I also know how much they pay generally. So I can use this as a relative cost. Now, if I'm an administrator, or maybe if I'm someone working with a lot of institutions, I could use this as a data point to say, okay, I have these 50 programs, 40 of them are working really, really well, but 10 of them are actually leaving students, and these are graduates, students that have done everything well and everything right. They paid tuition, they've gotten their degree, but they're still earning less than the average high school graduate, even though they've done everything right a few years after they've graduated. So what's going on? Is it the program itself? Is it the school itself? Or are we just sort of behind in the times and we're offering jobs that don't necessarily exist within the geographic region that we're operating in? So I think it's like a great dig deeper point that I'm starting to highlight in research that folks can use. And I also make the data readily available if anyone just wants to click on it and look at their institution or their state and sort of do their own analysis, right? Like it's there. And I want folks to use the data. The data is only good if you use it or if you know that it's there.
Thank you, Michael, for doing that for all of us.
And hopefully it's really easy. So I tried to make it easier to understand than the crazy, wieldy college scorecard data set. The last thing I'll mention is like, one of the things that I looked at specifically was low income students and the outcomes that they get, right? The ROI that they're getting. So this is the cost that they're paying versus the amount that they earn. And what did I notice when I did this cool ROI study? I thought, who falls at the top of the list for low income students? It happened to be Duke that offers the best ROI for low income students. Stanford, someone mentioned that they went there. University of Chicago, Harvard, Princeton. Now, how could this be? It's because if you get in there, you're hardly paying anything. You're super academically gifted and you're going to have a great ROI. But when I started to look at this, I was like, okay, good job, Michael. You just recreated the US News rankings for everyone. Pat on the back, Mike. But I started to look at the amount of Pell students that they also enroll, and I noticed that they're extremely low. So I thought about, okay, are these really serving the purpose of higher education? Or is higher education not supposed to meant to reproduce the same well-resourced schools year after year and highlight them in the list? Or is higher education meant to exist to actually lift, the next generation up and provide them with more, a better life than the previous generation? So I created this thing called the Economic Mobility Index, to where I combine these two things together, the ROI for low-income students and the percentage of low and moderate income students that an institution enrolls. And what happened? Harvard went from number 4, that was originally on my list, to number 847 in terms of economic mobility. University of Chicago went from number 8 to 860. And it doesn't mean that they're not good schools, but if you're a student that can get in there, you're probably going to succeed anywhere. But who shot to the top of the list? They happen to be the top 10. They're all Hispanic serving institutions located in California, New York, and Florida. They all serve majority Pell students, and they all show extremely strong economic return on investment. So I've created this new economic mobility, and folks are starting to react to it and think, okay, this seems a lot more useful than US News rankings. And this is actually showing schools that are doing the work. So I'll sort of stop there, but there's a lot of data out there that I'm just making available to folks. I hope it's helpful. Some institutions are highlighting it on their website, but I also hope that it's changing the conversation about who's really serving students well and where there's actual room for improvement.
Thank you, Michael. And I see that a couple of folks in the chat are sharing links to your data, and I know it was in the pre-read as well. I would highly encourage everybody to check it out. I think it's really important work. I'd love to bring Mamie into the conversation now as well. Mamie, informed by your work at the IHEP and with the Post-Secondary Value Commission, how would you guide us in establishing goals which best align our Colorado post-secondary ecosystem with the creation of equitable value for students?
Absolutely. Thanks, Josh. And it's so great to be here with such wonderful colleagues, and thrilled to go after Michael here, because so much of the work that we did with the Value Commission aligns with the concepts and ideas that Michael is putting forth with data use, using the scorecard data as well. So it's great to be part of this conversation, and really appreciate the focus that you all are putting on equitable value and really intentionally putting your efforts there. So as you embark on this critical work, I'll offer 3 pieces of advice to keep in mind. One is to measure value, and Michael has already kicked off that part of the conversation. The second is to center equity, and I think that's a theme that we've heard through comments from Jamie and Rachel and Michael. And then the third is to lead towards change, embrace these measurements and this focus on equity to move towards change that delivers greater opportunity for students. And I'll talk through each of these in a bit more detail. So the first one around measurement. Higher education has long been focused on issues of college access, and then the field shifted towards a focus on completion. But now, as Michael was saying, we're in a new phase, a new wave of post-secondary policy development that is focused on the returns to education, or the value of higher education. And that's really what the Post-Secondary Value Commission took up. They embraced this moment, and we brought together a diverse array of experts. We had 30 experts across higher education and business to come together and define post-secondary value. And I think this definition aligns with some of the conversation we were having earlier here about the varied roles of higher education in society. The definition that the Commission came up with is that students experience post-secondary value when provided equitable access and support to complete quality, affordable credentials that offer economic mobility and prepare them to advance racial and economic justice in our society. So it's that both end about economic returns to the individual, economic returns to society, and those non-economic benefits of higher education as well. Now, the Commission also developed a series of earnings and wealth thresholds that serve as a framework for measuring post-secondary value. So this definition kind of gives a big picture, star to aim for, and then the measurement framework talks about how to bring data to bear on the conversation. And we created a tool that also uses college scorecard data and has some metrics that are pretty similar to what Michael talked about in terms of measuring things like the minimum economic returns that a program or a degree should deliver to students, all the way up through things like wealth parity. What is the role of higher education in dismantling the racial wealth gap that has too long persisted in this country? And these data all help us to understand which institutions and programs are doing well at promoting economic mobility for students. In other words, it answers the questions, how much better off are students after having attended? Now, that brings me to the second piece of advice here, and that's to center equity in this work. Measuring value in the aggregate, it's insufficient. We absolutely have to center equity both in measurement and in decision making. And that means focusing on disaggregates like income and race and gender, because we see deep inequities once we begin to examine the data in those ways. So the Post-Secondary Value Commission centered equity by focusing specifically on assessing these metrics about how institutions and programs are providing post-secondary value to Black, Hispanic or Latinx students, Indigenous students, underrepresented Asian American and Pacific Islander students, students from low-income backgrounds, and to women. And from a measurement standpoint, that means disaggregating the data, the value data or the return on investment data by all of these different characteristics. But we also know that the data alone cannot change behavior or change policies. It's really the people using the data and using it thoughtfully that does drive change. So to fully leverage the potential of the measurement framework that the Value Commission put forward or the measurements that Michael has talked about, you need to really develop a culture of data use within the state of Colorado and on your campuses. And that can really lead to informed policymaking and decision-making with equity at its core. Now, data is part of equity. It's one component of centering equity, but it's not the only component. We recently convened a set of experts to focus in on this question of how do we really design policies that lead with equity. And we came up with a set of 5 principles to really guide equitable policymaking from start to finish. And data was certainly one of those principles, using data and empirical evidence to inform policymaking. But several other principles came to the forefront as well. Things around framing, and issues framing really shapes the creation of a relevant policy, and framing it as an issue of equity that will be worked to solve, that changes the delivery of and the development of policies. Second is around investments, where we invest as a society, where we choose to invest as policy decision makers really signals priorities. Participation is really important, so who participates in the policymaking process and those decisions really shapes the outcomes of those decisions. And then finally, language. Language needs to be precise and inclusive and people first and respectful. And all of these policy making principles need to be at the center of our decision-making process if we're to really move forward to address many of the inequities that all of us have been talking about this morning. And it can be really the difference between well-intentioned but counterproductive policy towards one that actually delivers transformational outcomes, the type that Michael was talking about for those institutions that jumps to the top of the list once you start accounting for the students who they're serving. And so finally, my final point is to focus on leadership. Your leadership matters. You are all leaders within Colorado, and you can use your voice. And so I urge you to use your voice, to embrace these principles and this focus that everyone this morning has been talking about around the value of higher education, because you can help to continue the momentum behind the equitable value movement by really taking what you learn about equitable post-secondary value as you dig into all of these data tools and then using it to drive change within the state. And by doing so, you can be part of creating that stronger future for all of us, and particularly for the people of Colorado, both to promote that economic mobility that we've all been talking about, the economic value that can come from investing in higher education, but also in building that enriching, healthier, happier, and more civically engaged populace that can come from greater levels of higher education. So I'll just sum up with those to focus in on measuring post-secondary value, centering equity within all of your decision-making processes, and then leading towards the change that you want to see in the state. Josh, it's been great to really engage in this. I'm looking forward to the rest of the questions and conversation.
Thank you so much. And I think those 3 points are incredibly helpful. And the leadership point in particular, hopefully is inspiring to everybody in this conversation, because certainly both the panelists, but as well as the participants in this conversation are all key stakeholders in our process in Colorado and continuing to try to lead on this dimension. So encourage everybody participating in this conversation today to continue to push us as a commission and engage with us on how we can push this forward in the right way. Building on some of what you just said and opening this up to everybody, I think there's sometimes perceived to be a tension that suggests that focusing on creation of equitable value for students could limit choice for students in terms of fields of study or career paths that really enable that equitable value creation or positive economic outcomes. Can you all speak to that tension a little bit?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. Because it's a great question, and it's one that we wrestled with a lot as part of the Value Commission's work. The short answer is that no, a focus on value should not be valuing an investment banker over a teacher. That's not the purpose of this work. It's about recognizing the various returns on a student's investment. And so the Value Commission really worked hard to avoid devaluing those fields of study that prepare students for high social value careers that are lower wages. Equitable post-secondary value means that all students should have the opportunity to pursue the career that is the best fit for them, that aligns with their goals and interests, as well as that aligns with workforce demands, because that's a reality of the situation. Because the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of students, as we've heard time and again, the reason they go to college is to get a better job. And they're investing real dollars in their education. In many cases, they're taking on debt in order to do so. And they have an expectation that that investment is going to pay off and at least leave them better off than had they not attended at all. And so it's not that more income is always better, but students should at least be able to expect that minimum level of return on investment, regardless of their field of study. And so the Value Commission's framework is designed to first and foremost assess those minimum economic returns. And we were actually able to model this out with the University of Texas system, who is on the vanguard of using post-secondary data to measure outcomes. I saw in the chat that Colorado has come a really long way there as well in terms of getting access to earnings information. By modeling this out with the UT system, we found that more than half of completers across every program of study within the system, and so that's including programs that prepare students for these types of socially valuable careers, like in education, they earn enough to achieve economic mobility within 15 years of graduation. That's above and beyond those minimum economic returns. They're also achieving mobility by getting to higher levels of the income spectrum. So these fields, they should be serving a societal need. We absolutely need them to, and I think that's become all too clear during the pandemic, how incredibly valuable social work and teaching professions are to our societal health. They also should be providing students with at least these basic economic returns, and ideally with opportunities for real social mobility. And this ultimately is a question of equity as well, because many of these professions are dominated by women, and particularly women of color. And so we also need to be opening up a societal conversation of how we are compensating people who are going into these incredibly valuable professions for our society, that keep our society running, and that those professions are being, for the most part, led by people of color and by women. And so all of that is really part of this value conversation as well.
Thank you, Mamie. Building on that, let me circle back to a question that Rebecca Holmes posed in the chat here. That says there's still great skepticism in traditional educated communities of color that these shifts towards skills-based education can actually be achieved with equity as a priority. Essentially, is it fair to say we see affluent white folks encouraging these shifts for quote unquote other people's children? What's the actual and/or narrative shift that tackles that fair concern? Who wants to take on that tricky conversation?
I can jump in a little bit on actuals. This is a conversation we have with Fortune 500 CEOs who are predominantly white men. In fact, way too many of them are even named John. It's a homogeneous group more than anything. And I think it really ties back to stackability. I'll use the trades as an example. I find it quite irritating when, particular communities of privilege stand behind a podium and say, I've got a 529 savings account for my kids. They never say that part. They do. But y'all's kids should just go into the trades, be plumbers. Let's start with the fact that actually a lot of folks who get a plumbing certificate are immediately launched into a six-figure income, can find a great job, but that job doesn't have any career mobility unless you learn soft skills, people management, how to run a small business, et cetera. And so something we've both pushed a lot of employers on and actually had to walk away from a few companies on is that if they want to offer trades programs, they have to allow them to stack into degree programs, into management, into business programs, and really communicate to the learner, hey, if you're taking a track like this, here is how that track builds you into the knowledge economy at some point, because it's also a very physical job and one that someone might not want to do for 50 years, but instead for a period of time. And so I think changing the conversation is really important. And a lot of it, I think Rebecca appropriately talks about the communities of color. It also starts with having conversations with communities of privilege in changing their perceptions and expectations about what a career path actually looks like if you're encouraging people to take that path.
Thanks,
And I'll
Rachel.
just say, like, you hear this, and it's often from the same people of privilege who are saying, well, we're giving opportunity to folks that other folks won't give opportunity to. But sometimes the opportunity that they're giving them is to programs that are drastically underperforming and going to leave them with a lifetime full of debt and ultimately perpetuate socioeconomic inequality rather than encourage it. And I do ask the same question of, would you send your kids there? And I don't get an answer. And when I look them up, like, I'm not calling them out online or whatever, but I don't see anyone sending their kids there who's advocating for very low performing programs. And they provide a lot of access, but ultimately, if they're providing access to a lifetime of unmanageable debt, it might not be worth it.
Thank you. Super important. And we just have a couple minutes left. Unfortunately, I know this conversation could go on for the rest of the day. And I'll certainly make sure that we're collecting all the questions and do our very best to get them answered asynchronously. But I'll throw in one more question. I'll go with this last one that just came in from Elizabeth Wiley. Is there data that spans the decades of a working lifetime related to this type of value outcome result? Post-graduation, meaning how flexible are these workers when it comes to adaptability? They may require over a work lifetime where job demands may shift or their abilities, physical or otherwise, may change over time. I suspect that this points to the tension between broader liberal arts style education and more specific trade-oriented education or professional-oriented education. So I think it's a really important topic. Anybody want to weigh in on that?
Just say, like, we have historic data that shows different career trajectories. And to your point, I think folks are talking about liberal arts for the most part. So, like, we only have 2 years of program level data right now through the department for people who graduated. And that liberal arts majors, like, they usually shoot up after about 5 years because they have these conceptual skills that help them build and ultimately succeed economically. But I did just want to mention in the program level data stuff is what we see with liberal arts majors at four-year colleges is they're actually doing pretty well. And what we see with teachers is shortly after graduation, they're actually doing pretty well. What we see it for liberal arts majors at two-year colleges is they're much less likely to succeed economically. It's more practical stuff that's actually helping them succeed economically. So the data is there, and it's sort of interesting to use it as static right now. But Doug Weber is someone who does a lot of stuff on career trajectory. He's an economist. So I would suggest, and some folks do bake this in to their ROI stuff. So it's something that it's real, and folks can consider it and use it with caution as they're interpreting this data.
And I'll just build on that I am certainly the least expert person in this conversation on this topic, but I am a deep believer in the magic of compounding in many aspects of life. And I suspect that magic extends to this question as well, that the trajectory you find yourself on early in your career compounds in a really magical way later in your career, and vice versa is also true. So I would assert that it's probably really important to help students, learners bridge that leap into their first career opportunities that then compound into their follow-on career opportunities.
I would just add, we have qualitative data, which shows that our folks who are able to embrace a learner's mindset, which is something any program, whether liberal arts or trades or you name it, can nurture in someone, that those students compound in how they then approach learning in the next stage and the next stage and the next stage of their career. And I think that's relevant because we actually don't know what skills people are going to need 20 years from now, but I believe the only future-proof skill is learning. And so as long as we are teaching our learners how to do post-secondary learning for themselves, I think we're arming them with the skill to then reskill and upskill at any interval.
Thank
Yeah,
you,
I think
Rachel.
that compounding is such an important framing, and because it follows through for equity as well. One thing that we see is that many of these gaps in earnings grow over time after college. And so particularly in the higher paying fields, STEM and business, the gaps, the earnings are much higher immediately after school, but then the gaps by race, ethnicity grow once you get to 10, 15 years out of school because of that compounding of discrimination within the workforce on top of discrimination that's happened throughout the education system.
And we are now basically out of time. And so with that, I will thank you all a lot and hand the mic here back to Eric, but also want to make sure that I also personally thank the whole CDHE team led by Dr. Angie Piccioni for their leadership in pulling this event together and helping us work through this process of continuing to be at the innovative forefront of post-secondary education here in Colorado. And so I'll hand back to Eric with that said.
And again, I will echo Josh, thanks for the panelists, Jamie, Rachel, Michael, and Mamie, for just the tremendous wealth of knowledge that you brought to us this morning. And just like to pass on to everyone who has attended, we had over 190 attendees, that we will capture all the questions and we will forward this back to our panelists. So maybe we can get some of those answered and just kind of get that back out to the group as follow-up. And again, just thank you for the opportunity to learn this morning and to be enriched. And we will carry this into our strategic planning process. And again, thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Have a great day.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks for hosting. Take care.